Can you make money if you design an open source board or open source project? How? Everyone knows your secret. Anyone can build your board or your project because it's open source. These were the very first questions I asked Alicia from Open Source Hardware Association. I had a call with Alicia and we talked about all the kind of different topics around open source, from companies designing and selling open source boards through how to promote your open source projects up to patents and trademarks. I recorded this call and that's what you will see in this video. So here it is. Here is my call with Alicia, and she starts with the answer to my very first question about how companies make money on open source. Enjoy this video.
There's a lot of different businesses out there that create open hardware. They basically all follow the same business model, which I love. This was at, I want to say it was the 2012 summit. Chris Anderson, who was editor of Wired at the time, got up on stage and said, okay, listen, I'm going to tell you the business model for open hardware, but I have to warn you, it is incredibly boring. What we do is we take hardware and we just multiply what it costs us to make by 2.5. And that's the whole business model right there. You sell it for more than you bought it for, right? So it's like a really, really simplistic business model. And I think that like we're able to use such simplistic business models because, again, we're not doing software, right? So like we don't have to sort of like try to either like figure out nonprofits around each hardware, or we're not trying to kind of like figure out some kind of subscription model or things like that. Like it's just hardware. It's just hardware is hardware is hardware, and people pay for that.
So what does it mean?
So
I'm sorry for interrupting. Does it mean like you make your schematic available to everyone, you make your PCB available to everyone, but you still also will manufacture the hardware, and you will sell it 2.5 times more than it costed you to build it. But the question is, like, will people still buy it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's a great sort of mind exercise to think about, you know, at least, especially I think in the US, where we have such a consumer culture, how many people are consumers versus how many people are makers? Mm-hmm. How many people just want the thing to exist? Mm-hmm. And I think this also happens within, you know, engineering, when you start realizing like, yes, I can make that, but is it worth my time to make mm-hmm. that? You reach a level of engineering where like, you know, nobody's sitting here like creating their own resistors, right? They're pennies. Nobody's going to try to like, you know, oh, I have to like, you know, have every single piece that I've created. No, like you go buy certain things that are easily and accessible and, you know, cheap enough. And then you toss those all together in your own design, right? And so I think that a lot of culture also doesn't necessarily know how to do that kind of stuff. And so if people don't have that engineering expertise, it's much easier just to purchase the product. So there's been a number of really successful businesses in open hardware. Open hardware is a multi-million-dollar industry. We've got lots of different examples of businesses all around the world. Here's a number of businesses here. There's Lulzbot, SparkFun, Seed Studio, Adafruit. And then the last one, that corner down there, is MakerBot, which started out open source hardware. Interestingly, in this whole grouping, they are the only place that took VC funding, and they are the only business that ended up going closed, even though they were very successful at making money as an open hardware business.
I didn't know SparkFun is like, oh, I think all the boards, what they designed, they are like open source, what they sell.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And the other one was, you mentioned SparkFun, and then Seed Studio, or?
Yep. So Seed Studio, those are all in electronics, and they've, you know, all of those companies started sort of like very early on in the open hardware movement. The 3D printing world was very much open hardware when we started as well, but the companies kind of started after, once we sort of had the definition and things like that. Then, and I think actually what's really interesting about 3D printing is there was a patent that was up in right around the area of like 2010, right around when the open hardware definition was being created. And because that patent was up and could no longer be protected, it had its 30 years or whatever as a monopoly. It was released as public domain, and then you just saw innovation shoot up within 3D printing, and that's why a lot of the 3D printing companies were able to do open hardware.
And the first picture is what?
So that's Lulzbot. That's or Aleph Objects. So that is their manufacturing floor, and they are a 3D printer company. And there's other, there's tons of 3D printing companies that stemmed from the RepRap 3D printer, which was created at the University of Bath. And so including MakerBot, including Lulzbot, there's the Perusa, which is also a really popular piece of open hardware. All of those came from the same parent of the RepRap 3D printer.
But is also Perusa open hardware? No, they just are they? I didn't know.
Perusa is also very open hardware. Actually, Joseph Perusa even has an open hardware tattoo on his arm.
Wow, I think they're a Czech company.
Yes.
Yeah, that's why I remember, because Czech is close to Slovakia.
Yeah.
Okay, and do you know background about SparkFun, for example, how they started?
I know a lot about how SparkFun started. So full disclosure, I am married to SparkFun. I'm married to Nathan Seidle, so he's the founder of SparkFun. So he founded it like 17 or 18 years ago now. Nate, how long did you form SparkFun? When was SparkFun formed?
2003.
2003.
So 19 years.
19 years. So so SparkFun, I think, is one of the oldest open hardware companies, founded in 2003. It was founded, so Nathan fried his microcontroller in his dorm room, doing, he was going through electronic or engineering school. And he fried, I think at that time, Arduino wasn't around, right? So he was using a PIC microcontroller or something, fried it, and then, but learned a lot from that thing, right? So there was a spark, right? Stuff had a little teeny tiny fire. And then he was wow, I need a new part. And I'm a student. And so how do I get this cheaply? So he went online. He actually found a company named Olmex, who also creates open hardware in Bulgaria. And it was this, he had to fill out a form. He had to fax the form, right? This is all early days of the internet too. And really early days of e-commerce, I should say. And so he ended up getting that part from Olmex, and then realizing that 3 other kids in his class had this problem. So he bought parts from Olmex for them, upcharged them, and started a company, right? His third order was from France. He had to go dumpster diving for boxes because he was so, he just thought he'd be selling to other CU students. And he put a website up that had a picture of the thing, which not a lot of websites had pictures of the electronics device. And he put a quarter next to it. And so you could see the size. And so it was a lot more information than people were used to getting on the for e-commerce sites and that day. And it just took off. And so then 19 years later, he is still doing open hardware. And there's a lot of great talks out there, both, from all of these companies about why open hardware works and why open hardware is profitable for them, right?
This is interesting. So basically, you can make money when designing open hardware the way that you also sell it.
Exactly. Yes. And I will say, there's some things that I think there's some extra steps going through the process of opening your hardware, right? You have to, you basically have to document how you made it. And that documentation can take a lot of time. right, which takes resources to create. But on the flip side, some of the benefits of open source, you get a really engaged community, and they will tell you their feedback constantly, right? Because you've got everything there. You've got your GitHub files with code and everything else. And so your community will also like kind of help you engineer a bit, right? And so they will say like, hey, this piece of code isn't working on this machine over here, like, right? Like they're constantly testing and letting you know. And because there's that mechanism of like, oh, I can just see it on GitHub. I could change the code myself if I know how, or I could like let the company know. There's all kinds of mechanisms to be able to like, report back, right? You also get attribution, which is kind of like, citation if you're used to like the publishing world. It also kind of gives a provenance for all the derivatives, creates a share like, yeah.
Yeah. So before you move to next slide, I would like to ask, like, this looks easy what you are saying, but I think what people may ask, like, how other people will actually learn about your open source project. Isn't that like super complicated? So what would you recommend? Someone will create open source project, and how they share it with others. Are there like some platforms maybe where they should place these projects, or how does it work?
So there's lots of different places that you can share your open hardware, because if it's buried in GitHub, that's not really like, probably that searchable, or you have to be like really specific and know what that creator called things. So there's platforms like Hackster or Instructables, or
can we search for them so people can?
So there's Hackster.
How does it work?
So this is you basically like put your open hardware up here, right? Or your hardware in general. I don't know that they
just
force
click on a
everything to be
project
open.
so we can see what is inside.
Sure. So here's like a streaming video LCD display, right? And so there's like things used in this project. So it tells you what's used, tells you like the code that you need. There's a video of it running. There's just basically instructions, right? For how to do something. And then little Q&A. Here's the schematics, right? So this is how you like set it all up. There's the code. Here's a bunch of credits. So that's these platforms are pretty similar to each other, right? Like Instructables is the same kind of thing. And
I never heard about Instructables.
Oh yeah, they're the OG.
So basically, anyone, even without their own website, they can share projects through this kind of
exactly.
platform.
Yep. So if you don't have a very popular website, you can do it through here. Another place you can do it, if you're looking for crowdfunding, Crowd Supply pushes their creators to do everything open source. And so they are like a Kickstarter type of company. So this is actually stuff that's not just the instructions of how to create it, but these are, orders, right? And so they're taking orders for their thing. Like this one's raised $100,000, right? And so it's kind of like Kickstarter, right? So you can like kickstart your thing. You can show people a prototype and they can say, yes, I want to purchase this. And then you make your money up front and you sell it when you've manufactured it.
So these are the ways how maybe other already existing communities may find out about interesting projects. I think some people, what I remember, they also use like Reddit or something like this for sharing the projects.
Yeah, I mean, it really also kind of depends like the specific industry you're in, right? So like if you are doing open source hardware science, like if you're a citizen scientist or if you're a scientist at a university, there's the Gathering of Open Source Hardware website, Gathering Open Hardware. which is, in short, it's called Gosh. And so they put on conferences. They've got a really active forum, but everybody knows at Gosh that like, if you're into like science, that's kind of your platform to go talk about, you know, how you're doing the hardware. Here's projects, right? And how you're building the projects and all that kind of stuff. So it really kind of depends like which community you go to, sort of which industry you're part of. Every industry sort of has a different place that they like to frequent, I would say.
Do you know how some of open source hardware projects become popular? Like, I don't know, the open source ventilator, for example, or I think you have some examples of open source, popular open source projects. Yeah.
So one of the super popular pieces of open source hardware out there is Arduino microcontroller.
Yeah.
Right. So that's you know, it's had loads and loads of derivatives. Here are several derivatives. And I think that the derivatives actually help point back to the original platform. And so by people creating a bunch of derivatives, every single time somebody runs across that derivative, they're actually like then going and saying like, oh, I understand now this is like a derivative of this thing over here. And so then they learn about that thing over there as well. So with open hardware, because you can sort of like, you know, infiltrate the world with it, you can learn about it in all kinds of different, from different companies, from different stores. It might not be the Arduino store that you go to first, but maybe you learn about it because you purchased a lily pad or something like that, right? If you're interested in doing wearables and sewing. So I think there's a lot of things like that where it's like kind of another benefit of open hardware, right? Typically, you're trying to, you know, sort of squash your competitors, right? When you have a product. But in open hardware, it's a little bit of the reverse where you have to give them attribution. You have to give them credit. You have to say, this is a derivative product of Arduino, right? And so because that attribution is in there, then you end up getting attribution other places than just your own website. And so people can find it like that too.
I have a couple of questions, but now I think people would ask, but you know, are not they like stealing the business from the original project? Because then, you know, people would not buy the original board. But I guess there is not really much what you can do with this. I think Arduino maybe become, or many people went back to Arduino, for example, because of software, I guess. Because there were many companies who copied or cloned the hardware, but they really didn't provide it any other things. So maybe that's something what, when someone will create open source hardware, maybe they should provide some kind of other benefits which will bring people back even if someone will copy the hardware.
Right. So yeah, I think what's really interesting about this is that Arduino's been around since 2008, right? And they're still around. Yeah. They're still making a profit. And so if the argument were true that, you know, you would be able to sort of take that thing and sort of like make the derivative more popular or like take the money away or whatever, then I think they'd be out of business. But what happens with open hardware is that you have to innovate constantly. People are innovating in ways that the original company would have never innovated, right? Like Arduino probably would have never thought to do what Leah Beakley did in creating the LilyPad Arduino. They probably would have never thought to make it a wearable thing where you could then take thread that is conductive and sew it into clothing and make all these like, you know, various garments or, you know, censored pieces of clothing and things like that. So I think what it does is it kind of like opens up the collective mind to basically innovate freely in a way that everybody's kind of like on the same page with. And then the other thing is I think that it actually really pushes companies to be innovative, right? And so Arduino has had to continue to innovate, right? So they didn't just stop at the, you know, the Duevo Milla or whatever, you know, popular Arduino was in like 2008 or 2010 or whenever that was. they continued to innovate, right? They created the Mega. They created this little joystick down here. They created then all kinds of different things because you basically have to with an open hardware, right? You have to listen to your customers. You have to take an innovation into, sort of into your business model. And you have to say, like, okay, what features do they want? What platforms do they want? What are all these things that kind of create reasons that people buy? Mm-hmm. Is it cheaper? Can I ship it faster? Like people buy, I love asking this question. So how many people here buy things because of how many patents they have on them? Who looks up a patent first and says, oh, okay, I'll buy it because it's got 37 patents?
Like it's
like nobody shops that way. People shop because of, features or colors or price or, all those kinds of things. The other really interesting thing I think is like open hardware can make things so much more global than you ever could, right? So Arduino did not, translate everything into Chinese day two, right? But Seed Studio, being in China, they had a whole other market that Arduino could never reach on their own, that now Eric Pan through Seed Studio is reaching for them, right? And those people are learning about Arduino through Seed Studio's projects and products, and then coming back and saying like, oh, and then there's like this whole other Arduino world. Isn't that interesting, right? So I think that it's almost more of an argument that the derivatives kind of end up making you even more money.
Popular.
Like, sure, you could argue that like, oh, well, if they had made all these derivatives, they could make all the money from it. But I think in reality, there's a number of business cases here that they're not even either thinking of, right? Because everybody's creativity kind of has certain limits, right? And at some point you need another head, you need another brain to like also use that creativity. Or they would say like, okay, well, that's great that company's doing this flexible Arduino, but we don't understand the use case for that. And we don't think our customers are going to buy it. But maybe that place has a use case and customers that would buy a flexible PCB, right? So it just kind of all depends on where their business models are and where their community's at and what kind of purchasing power their community has and what they're interested in.
Mm-hmm. I have another note. So we were talking about patents, but I guess also what is helping Arduino is maybe the trademark, like Arduino.
Yes. Yes.
So maybe that's something what could kind of help a little bit protect open source hardware. Mm-hmm. What is your experience with maybe using trademark on open source boards?
Yeah, that's a great question. So using trademark, first of all, I just want to address the concept of can hardware survive only using trademark, right? And where we've seen this before is the fashion industry. So the fashion industry is not allowed to use copyright or patents because clothing is a common good, right? You have to be clothed. Therefore, the patent and trademark offices around the world do not allow for clothing to be patented and copyrighted. So all fashion can lean on is the trademark. And what happens in fashion, you have a spring collection, a fall collection, a summer collection, a winter collection. They innovate 4 times a year. So if there is a use case for saying that, that patents kind of stifle innovation and open hardware sort of, promotes innovation, I would say we look at the fashion industry and what happens when you can't have patents, when you can only survive on trademark, and we see constant innovation. So I think that's, a really great scenario. And then also up here, so you are absolutely right that
if someone think they have like popular open source project, they can build or register their own trademark, and
yes,
that could be
yeah,
one
and
of
so definitely, and I think one of the really interesting or one of the really important pieces to know when you're creating a derivative is that you cannot use another company's trademark without their permission, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, like right down here, there's the Arduino logo.
But you are not supposed to use, I guess, because I've seen many times people using the trademark.
Yeah, so it is illegal, and it is fairly easy to just send a letter to say like, hey, you're using this trademark. And a lot of times you can go to the level of a cease and desist. And if your trademark is registered through your country's patent and trade office, that's it. Like the cease and desist will occur. But it is, I think, much nicer to just go the route of sending an email first, right? Like, we're all people, like it's always nicer to get like a nice gram than a nasty gram, right? So, and a lot of times in the open hardware community, what we found is it's just somebody who's overlooked it, or it's an accidental thing. They didn't realize that was a trademark logo, things like that. I think it's somewhat kind of confusing because you have to give attribution, right? So you have to say, this derivative is from Arduino, but you do that in the text on your website, right? You link to Arduino or whatnot. Or you do that in the text in the GitHub. You do not do that by putting their logo on your piece, right? Unless, so like there's a lot of derivatives here, right, that have no Arduino logo, right? These don't have an Arduino logo, right? What's interesting, if you see the LilyPad, it says the LilyPad Arduino. And so the Leah Beakley, when she created the LilyPad, she worked with Arduino so that she could use the Arduino name, right? And so she pays a royalty or whatever for that trademark. And so, which is very typical for hardware.
Another way how to make money. So you can
absolutely
license the trademark, for example.
Yeah.
I would like to say, just to give an idea, people, how much it costs, because I registered a couple of trademarks. So it's kind of easy to do it in Europe and also in the US. And it's like, I think, €1,000 or $1,000. It depends how many categories you register. I think in US it is even cheaper. It can be like starting from $500 or something like this. But I think in US, if you are not US citizen, now they changed the law and you need to find a lawyer to actually file it for you.
Right. So in the US, the provisional patent is only $1,000, but that actually doesn't give you a patent.
No,
so
I don't mean patent. I mean trademark. Sorry.
Oh, trademark. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Trademarks are cheap. They're easy to get. They're not too much to maintain. It's fairly simple.
But do you help with this as your organization is helping with all this open hardware? Can someone like ask you questions how to do it, or? We have we help in the way of certifying open hardware. So that's like kind of another layer of protection you can get. So this is our certification site here. And you can, learn about what certification is. You can certify a project. There's also a database of all the projects that are certified that you can search for. So that's another way to find open hardware. Oops, let me go back. But then if you wanted to certify your piece, you get a second trademark logo from Oshawa. And so now you have like two companies that have trademarked logos that you can apply and put on your board. And then there's sort of like, power in numbers, right? So now not only do you have your trademark on your board, you've got Oshawa's trademark on your board that we license to you for free. Okay, I have a question. So
yeah,
if I understand right, if you have good project, you don't even need to like apply for your own trademark. Basically, they can people can ask to be certified by your organization, and it's free, correct? Or isn't?
Yes.
And they can then use your logo, which provides some kind of protection.
Right.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
And so in theory, right, if somebody like copied, the trademark and the certification logo and like kind of just a direct clone, right, then you could say, hey, you've got my logo on your board or whatever. And then Oshawa could say, hey, you are using somebody else's certification number and you are not that person, right? And so it could be coming from two different places that are saying you are not allowed to, create this hardware. You did not do the correct pathway and whatnot, and you're not like giving correct attribution this way. So that's what the certification gives you, and it has a country code and then a unique identifier number as well. so that we can find you and know exactly what your hardware is. And then in the database, as I mentioned, it also it tells people where your source is as well.
So are there like many projects registered or certified by you?
Yes. So that picture is a little bit old. That had 1,000. And I think that was from 2020. But now we are at 1,800 projects certified. So.
And then when they get certified, or when your project gets certified, then you can use the logo and the number, correct?
Correct. Yep. Yes. And part of that also came because our community was sort of saying like, hey, we had a communal logo that looks like an open gear. And the community was saying, this is great, but like, there's no rules around it, right? Anybody can use it for any reason. And it's still a great way to say, hey, my project is open source hardware, because this gear is so recognizable. And because so many people have used it, and a lot of people still do use it, but then they also put the OSHWA certification because it tells people like, yes, this is like for real open hardware. You can find the documentations, OSHWA has certified it. There's kind of like an extra layer of like trust and validness when OSHWA certifies something.
So you have like two logos, this one and the certification logo.
Yeah, this is kind of like the communal logo that absolutely anybody can use, whether or not your hardware really follows the proper definition of open hardware.
So what is proper definition of open hardware? Because I've seen so many companies like declaring like this is open source, and they just provide PDF schematic and that's open source for them.
Right. So basically open source hardware is the ability to remix, remake, remanufacture, redistribute, resell, study, and learn from, right? So if you have open source hardware, you have to allow everything, that whole set of things. Yes. And then, whatever your source happens to be, you have to basically put out enough source that somebody could realistically make a copy of it. And, just to point out too, open source isn't always for everybody. We often at OSHWA say like we're an option on the landscape of intellectual property, but it's not for everyone. And one of the things I had to do, so we created this checklist of, things to make your open hardware like open, right? So like all the things that you had to do. And so people would come up to me, like they would like email OSHWA or whatever, and they'd say, hey, I did everything that is on your checklist. I open sourced my hardware and somebody copied me. And I would say, congratulations, like you had enough source out there, like you did open source hardware, great job, right? But what it meant is we had to add a bullet point on this list, which was, are you emotionally prepared for your project to be copied, right? So I think, I kind of touched on it earlier where I said, for some people, it feels like giving away your baby, right? And for some people, that's not what they want to do. And then in that case, you absolutely like open source hardware is not your thing. But for people who are really interested in that sort of business case and that model of like sort of sharing and getting those benefits from the community, then if you're, as long as you're emotionally prepared to be copied, then like, great, go for it.
I can confirm this actually. When we have created, I have created number of open source projects. Some are partially open, some are like fully open. But at the moment when I was publishing all the documentation, I already knew there will be some people and some companies who will just copy it and use it in their products, and they will be making money on the work what I have done. So I knew that, but it's still not very nice feeling to see it happening.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. And it's funny because I think I was on the flip side of that. So I did a project called Build-A-Pons over here, which were light up Lego bricks. And so I had a Kickstarter. And the whole concept was to be able to make a light up Lego, right? And so I had to wait till 2012, and then the Lego patent was up on the shape and the form factor. And you saw again an explosion within the industry of the things that you could do with Lego, and so and in different
I'm going
shapes.
to interrupt you. So Lego
Yeah.
doesn't have patent on this anymore?
Not anymore. They had it for 70 years. Somehow they were
I
able to
didn't know
file
that.
enough extensions for 70 years. And finally, the USPTO said, nope, you're done. You've had your monopoly for 70 years. It's only supposed to be like 13 to 15, depending on the industry, or 13 to 17. But yeah, so they ended up with a 70-year patent. And so basically they said, okay, now everybody else can make this form factor of a Lego.
Wow.
So I made these little like light up bricks. And what happened was like, this was just like a, kind of like a little play business for me. Right. But the problem is that I have like this job at Oshawa. I had another job at the time. So like, I couldn't seriously also do all this. So what I was hoping, so I open sourced this, of course. And I've been continuing to hope that somebody else comes along and just makes these. But no, that hasn't happened yet, right? But like basically, like I'm not going to make these anymore, right? I made these for the Kickstarter. It was super fun, and I realized that like, wow, like either I would have to quit everything else I'm doing, and this would be my day job, but this is like way too much to do as a hobby. So yeah, so basically I'm like really hoping that somebody else like takes this ball and runs with it and makes money, whatever. I just want these things to exist so that I can buy them and I can build them into my Legos, right?
This is a very good point, because I think one of the probably most common reasons why people make open source projects is not only like they would like to share, but I guess they kind of hope it's going to be shared more quickly, and it will pick up, and everyone will be talking about their projects. But I would like to point out this not always happen.
Right. So I have a theory that, so the University of Wisconsin came up with this open source face shield with COVID. And that was the face shield that Ford picked up and ran with and made millions. And I have a theory that the reason they did that is because they didn't have to talk to any lawyers about intellectual property. They didn't have to get licensing and figure out royalties or do any of that. They could basically just like take that source, apply it, and manufacture, right? Like there was no weeks worth of lawyer communications and company communications and all that kind of stuff. It was basically just like the time, right, was just compressed because they could just take it and run with it.
So in some projects it can actually help that you don't need these kind of projects. They don't really follow, or they don't have to follow all the kind of regulations, because you are not really like selling it, but if someone else would like to use it or build it, here it is. You can do it.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, I remember now. There was this kind of question which we mentioned last time when we had a call, like, how is it with, with safety, for example?
Yeah.
Because what if something like this is dangerous, or it can be dangerous?
Right. So there's a lot of different examples of open hardware, right? So there's tons of different fields out there doing open hardware. So this is an open source hardware tractor. And this is kind of like our present day reality, right? Like what industries are doing open hardware. And then like you said, like what regulations apply to those industries. So there's a lot of things, and it really depends on where you are in the world, right? What regulations might apply. And of course, certain places in the world have fewer regulations. And, if somebody gives them designs for a tractor that they can like build a village from, then that's fantastic. That's what their need is right now. In other locations, that is not quite the need. And I don't know if, just kind of a segue, if you've heard of the John Deere issues with open source, or not with open source, but with, I don't know if this search is gonna pick up what I need, but yeah, so there's this whole thing around like tractor hacking, right? And so currently, all these tractor companies in the US are basically, farmers are being leased tractors
I
as the
I
hardware.
remember this. Yeah, I've seen, I read
Yes.
some articles because of the situation in Ukraine. I think they blocked the tractors there or something. And then I read an article where they exactly pointed out that this company actually, they told their customers that no, you don't own the tractor, you are just leasing the tractor because we
Right.
own the software or something like that.
Yes. So they own the software, right? And then you lease the tractors. So they get the software of like what you're doing with your fields and like how you're planting and all this other kind of stuff, and like the GPS data.
I read this, and then they sell the data, actually. That's what I read.
Yes. And like they can sell the data back to the seed companies, and then the seed companies can come back to you for like replanting the seeds, which you're somehow not allowed to do because like biology doesn't exist anymore. But like, so there's this huge thing, I highlighted this about right to repair, right? So there's a whole right to repair movement that's also like very akin to open source hardware. It's basically saying, hey, we need instructions out there on how we can repair, and people should be able to repair their own devices. That should be legal. And right now in the US, there's a couple laws in place that are making it more and more, or I should say like less and less legal, and less in this weird gray area where you're tied up where you can't even fix your own tractor. And if you're a farmer, you're very used to fixing your own tractor. And so like, that's just like this like crazy concept that, that you know, it's like, it just doesn't sit well, right? So
there is project which can hack these tractors?
Yeah, so there's an open source hardware tractor, right? But yeah, there's all kinds of, what's happened now is because of the right to repair movement, right? There's like different sites about like, hey, like hack your tractor, here's how to hack your tractor, right? And so there's kind of like questions about the legality of it. But there's farmers helping farmers figure out kind of how to get around all of these different issues where they can't even fix their own tractor anymore. Which, you know, I think in that sense too, like John Deere is sort of saying like, oh, but it has to be this way because of, you know, quality control. We can't just have anybody fixing our tractors kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But it's, you know, but it's kind of like, okay, well, where does that stop? So now I can't fix my washer, I can't fix my VCR. Like we just have to throw out something when a sensor goes bad because, you know, we're not allowed to fix it. It feels extremely wasteful. It's not good for the environment. Like, and it just seems, at least from the maker hacker perspective, it's just like, this is not what we stand for. This is not what we live for, right? And so I think there's certain industries that take the quality control and sort of hide behind it and say like, oh, but we can't do this way. And then there's other industries where there's all kinds of, you know, various like regulations in place. Like, you know, one of the industries is open source space. That's really interesting in terms of open hardware.
So are there some open source hardware projects for space?
There's actually an entire nonprofit dedicated to open hardware in space, which is called Mach 30. I think it's Mach30.org. Yeah. So they do all kinds of open source space. So they're, you know, there's a member of OSHWA, but they have designed like some test stands, some engines. They've got, but talk about like an industry that's standardized, holy cow, right? Like, so the whole space industry is incredibly, you know, relies on, of course, quality control and standardizations and all this stuff. And so currently we have a group of aerospace engineers working with OSHWA to kind of port some of the most important standards over into an open sourced format so that it can be easier for engineers to create open source space stuff. The CubeSat.
When you certify this kind of open source projects, then do you consider also this kind of like, I don't know, recommendations or something from the industry?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we've got lots of different industry partners whenever so what our goal would be at Oshawa is to create a best practices for aerospace. And then those best practices, yeah, we would work with the industries to make sure that we've, kind of got it right. We just did this with the FPGA community and came up with the best practices for FPGAs. So this is on Hackaday, right? And so this is like, hey, even like CubeSats, right? So these little tiny cute satellites, you can make your own. They're open source. But I love it because this is like, hey, here's the pain of building your own, right? Like you might not want to build your own. You might want to just go buy one from the company because it's cheaper in terms of like your time, right? But yeah, so this is another example. And, but in terms of regulations, what I wanted to bring this back to is like, so there's in the US, there's ITAR regulations, right? And that's this group that makes sure that like you're not, selling like missile data or something to another country, to, North Korea or whatever, right? And so there is something to be said for like, yes, of course we want like, we want our nations to be secure. We want to be able to protect some, like military secrets, whatever that happens to be. We want to be able to have defense. But what does that mean when people start building their own satellites and open sourcing them, right? So that's another thing that the aerospace industry has to work a lot with is, okay, what is legal that we can put out there and what is not legal and that would be considered sort of like a national secret.
And you are helping with creating these kind of guidelines.
Yeah, so this would kind of be within the best practices set that we're working with that industry group on right now.
And you mentioned FPGAs or something. So what about the FPGA?
Yeah, so we just created a best practices for sharing FPGAs or kind of like discerning with the industry, like where the software starts and stops and where the hardware starts and stops, right? And so this is kind of the best practices for FPGA designs. And it sort of talks about, like the nomenclature and the design itself. And again, like where that design means it's software, where that design can be applied to hardware. And then, what the important components are, and then licensing. So it kind of goes through all of the different steps of open source hardware, but very specific to the FPGA community. And so to do this, we worked heavily with like the FOSSI Foundation and a couple other foundations that were, within the FPGA community.
Do we have some other examples of interesting open source projects in your presentation?
Yeah. So there's other interesting examples, yes. Well, so another highly regulated industry, right, is biotech. So in this example, this is the OpenPCR. And so what this does is, and I'm like not a bioscientist, so I'm hopefully won't botch this, but basically it has to do with DNA sequencing. So these devices were at hospitals, solely at hospitals for $10,000, right? And now you can buy it on Amazon for $600, right? This is an open source PCR device that you can do your own DNA sequencing on if you so choose. This open source PCR, they're not trying to sell to the hospitals, right? They're not saying like, hey, ours comes attached with all of the same quality control and guidelines and all that stuff. They are saying like, hey, if you just want to dabble yourself in like biohacking, this is the device to get, right? It's cheap, it's available, it's, you can buy it, you can make it. But they're not trying to say like, oh, every hospital, we should just replace all these hospital PCR devices, But yeah, I just think it's like it's very interesting to think about, where are the use cases? And just because something needs to be certified in one area doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be certified for a different use case, for another audience, for another area. And we definitely want to, make sure that people know that, say OpenPCR has certifications for certain things. That doesn't mean that if somebody else creates a derivative that those certifications still apply. They would have to go and get the same certifications, whatever medical certifications are standard in that field, if they so choose to. But, Oshawa is really all about the intellectual property. It's about the IP. So we don't like do medical certifications or anything like that, of course. And we also don't want people to think that they can like just apply any certification to their derivative, because that's not how it works. That's not even how the certification works at OSHA, right? If you create a derivative, you would also have to apply for your own certification, right? So certifications are specific product certifications that's for that product and that product only. And then there's like other useful applications that don't require certifications. This is a Wi-Fi enabled flamethrower that's built with all open source hardware. So, just like our communities also does like really playful, fun things, various Burning Man projects, etc. But I think it's important to recognize that there's like a whole world of, because of the accessibility of open hardware, of platforms like the Arduino, artists and designers and other people are able to get into this field, and it's no longer just locked to engineers, right? And so what it's done is like it's made like this whole, now we have a job field called creative technologist, right? How cool is that? Definitely was not a career choice when I was in high school or college, but I think it's just really cool that like this has opened up so many fields of study, just by making something accessible and attainable and cheap enough for people to buy.
Cool.
And then
so like medical projects are very popular in open source.
So it's really interesting. Actually, I've got a not that one, this one. So if you see, I don't know if it's blocking it. So if you see over here, right, our industry is kind of blown up into more than just microcontrollers. Open hardware started in electronics, but at this point, we're talking about, like here's, 3D printing certain things for emergency response that are open source. Here's the open source car. There's open source shoes. There's musical instruments. There's crochet projects. There's jewelry, right? It's so much more than it used to be with just electronics. So this field is really expanding rapidly. And, I always hate to say that there's any silver lining to the whole pandemic, but if there was any silver lining, it made people recognize the value of open source, whether or not they're understanding that term. But everybody sort of like, when this pandemic hit, everyone started making their own face masks or purchasing face masks from somebody who could make them. People started uploading their face mask design, right? Like, hey, here's the sewing pattern, right? So all of that kind of stuff is open source hardware. And the face shield example I gave before with the University of Wisconsin and Ford. And then there were also some systems that started getting certified by OSHA for medical devices. But so far, like the medical device field, I think was like always one of the fields that I had always thought like, with all their certifications, for example, with all the quality control, like that's going to be a really hard pitch for open hardware to ever break into. And then the pandemic hit, and we are seeing so much more open source hardware in the medical field than we had ever imagined would be possible. So
because I guess I'm sorry for interrupting. I guess it's because of all the regulations, and it would take ages to go through regulations, but people actually needed like quick solutions or quick products.
Exactly. That's exactly right. They needed more minds working on it than just their own engineers. They were too slow. They needed they needed quickness, right? This is Medtronic. This is a huge scientific bio company that creates like pacemakers and ventilators and all kinds of stuff, things that are heavily regulated, right? And they were more or less, I don't know if the right word is like forced, but they basically couldn't do it themselves and recognized that and said, hey, here's our ventilator specifications, right? So they actually opened one of their patents. It's not as far as like open sourcing something, but they opened it. They said, hey, register here and we will send you basically our source files and hopefully you can help us and you can create like, you can maybe help build a project off of this. But there's definitely, certain aspects of this where like they wanted to still have control over the end product and things like that. Wanted to know who was doing it and that kind of thing. But it's like, I would have never thought this possible before the pandemic, that Medtronic would open up a patent and say, hey, we're not going to go after anybody as long as this is used in the ventilator field. Go ahead and use it. We clearly need more ventilators out there. Like, we're not going to stand in your way, right?
So are there some popular areas for open source hardware? Like,
in the medical field?
No, I mean, like, which one is the most popular? Microcontrollers.
Well, the most popular is definitely still electronics. So we've got a graph down here, and this is from our certification data. So it's certainly not the entire world of open source hardware, but it's what's been certified. And so you'll see like electronics is like huge, and it's like really big in the US. And that's probably because two of the biggest open hardware companies, SparkFun and Adafruit, you know, during the pandemic, put all of their open hardware through the certification process. But if you look at this map down here, I think it's a lot more interesting. So you've got
3D printing so much.
3D printing is huge. There's IoT, there's tools, right? So people open sourcing tools, there's education, wearables, robotics, sound, right? So there's all kinds of things. And then this side over here has which countries are kind of doing a lot. So there's like a lot of education coming out of like Bulgaria, and a lot of IoT coming out of Bulgaria. There's, you know, a lot of tools coming out of Mexico, and a lot of IoT coming out of Mexico, which is super interesting. So yeah, so this are kind of like all the other fields. And then electronics was up here because of just the strong correlation there. It would have really thrown the graph. But yeah, so people are, you know, really, the fields are really, really expanding. And even into, you know, so there's a ventilator here that was open sourced through our certification, but then there's also like different kind of like robots, and like thinking through robots, right? So this was because of COVID, because, you know, people didn't want to be like touching the food, but this was this whole robotic process that would basically like prepare your food and like get it out the door, which was open sourced, right? So I think there's all kinds of different creative solutions that we sort of came up with as a society because we had to, right? Because the speed at which the pandemic happened was faster than I think anybody expected. The severity, the unknowns, all of that just spurred huge amounts of creativity. And it really also sort of gave me hope for humanity, that people wanted to share it rather than coming up with something and then like hoarding that information, right? It was like, they were like, oh, like clearly it's my human responsibility to like share this with humanity. So like other people can have a cheap ventilator. Like if you're in a under-resourced, you know, village or town or area of the world, you don't need, again, like if there's a ventilator that's out there that will help you, I think you may have been just happy for any kind of design for a ventilator, right? Whether or not it was certified, again. And so it was like, or whether or not it had certain quality control factors to it and things. I think there's different populations, different audiences for all of this various hardware that we're talking about.
So if someone is thinking about designing something and making it open source hardware, what would you recommend? What they should be thinking about? What they should build?
Yeah, so I think it's great to go through the open hardware checklist. I think in terms of what you should build something that you want, right? Like if you don't want your own product, I'm not sure that there's like a broader audience out there for that, right? And I think yeah.
But I think many people, I completely agree with you. If I build something, it's something what I want to use. But sometimes people are thinking like, oh, what maybe people would like to buy from me, or what I would like to design something which will make me popular or something. I'm not exactly sure if that's the best way to actually think, because if it's open source, you are doing it to enjoy building it, and definitely people should be working on something what they would like to really build, not because of they would like to make money, but because they really just enjoy building it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's lots of different reasons that people might go into business or build hardware, right? I've heard it said a lot that
Okay,
people
tell me
build
your
open source
experience.
hardware to make money. What's that?
Tell your experience. So what did you hear? I interrupted you.
Oh, I've heard a lot of people say that they build open source hardware to make money, right? And so absolutely, that might be true, right? Like people might say like, okay, what is going to get funded, right? What do people want on this platform? Oh, they want an open source hardware laptop. Okay, that's what I'm going to build to make money, right? They might, yeah, you might get your ideas from all over the place, but I think it's just that, right? Is that ideas are a dime a dozen, and until you actually build the thing, that's really like when the true market sort of hits. But I think using these platforms, for me at least, it was really interesting because you could see really where your market was and how much people were wanting to spend on it. So you could see kind of if there was a market there or not, right? So there's some, right? So there's some like here that like aren't funded yet, only 22% funded. So you could probably kind of start figuring out like, oh, okay, like people aren't interested in that, or people are really interested in that, or like, oh, I kind of priced that wrong. So I actually went through that myself, where when I did my first Kickstarter, I did 2 Kickstarters, and the first one failed and the second one succeeded, right? So this one succeeded, I got $40,000. But the first one, I just set my goal like way too high. And then because of that, I set my price point too high. So by setting my price point lower, I got more backers, and I got a price point that I was still able to manufacture like that number of pieces, right? I think that one of the big mistakes people can make is sort of not going through their bill of materials list and sort of just picking a number, and then also not capping how many of those they can realistically make, right? So with injection molding, I was in a little bit of an easier position because you can, once the mold is paid for, it's very cheap to then make those things. But if you're sitting there making something by hand, and then all of a sudden you accidentally like blow up and you end up getting like 10,000 orders, and now you have to make 10,000 of something by hand, that's a much different scenario. And I think sometimes people don't always think that through. And then I think sometimes Kickstarters and these crowdfunding platforms can kind of get a bad rap for like having, things that you paid for that then never kind of came to fruition.
So what was your first Kickstarter project?
It was the same thing. So I basically just ran it again at a lower price point and made my goal, right? So yeah, the first time I wanted to say like, I was trying to get like 100,000. And then like I had priced things, instead of $45 per kit, it was like $100 per kit or something. And so I learned that the community was not willing to pay $100 a kit. So I had to like sort of, do some market analysis, right? With how much people were willing to pay for a light up Lego.
How did you do that?
I mean, so basically the failed Kickstarter taught me the most, right? With, there was feedback that people were giving me as I was doing the Kickstarter, right? So like I'd post something about it and people would say, oh, like $100, that's really expensive for Lego, right? And there was a couple like parent platforms that I was on. And so like the parents would kind of give me feedback and they'd say like, oh, I really like this concept and my kids would love it. But like $100 for a kit, that's like what I'm paying for like the entire Lego kit. And with yours, I'm only getting 18 pieces. So I also learned like the number of pieces for the toy industry, for whatever reason, is like a huge thing to parents. So I had to be cognizant of like how many pieces were in my kit and then sort of map that to how many pieces were in a regular Lego kit, even though like mine were light up and special and whatever. But yeah, so I did the same Kickstarter twice, I just tweaked all the numbers.
That's interesting to share this kind of experience. It can help some people.
Yeah. So I think, but it's a great way to figure out if there's a market for the thing that you want to build or not.
So you didn't fail, you learned.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I shipped all my pieces, and then I was like, okay, is this my real job or do I want to be doing something else? And I really love working at a nonprofit because I felt like when I was doing my Kickstarter, that, and I think this was something I was not prepared for, but you just constantly have to be a broken record for your own product. And so I kept feeling like I had to constantly promote myself and constantly promote my product. And that's just part of doing business, right? Like when you start out, it's just you as well. Like you don't have a marketing team and everything else. And so it just kind of felt really like that's just not my style to like promote myself. Where I am at now with the Open Source Hardware Association, I get to promote like all kinds of other things and like sort of doing things for the good of sharing, right? And I love thinking about it from the perspective of like, you know, when you're in kindergarten, we teach 5-year-olds to share, right? And so like, could you imagine a world in which you taught your kindergartner to say like, okay, you can let somebody else use your crayons, but every time they make a drawing with that, they owe you 5 cents. And they should also just pay you for using the crayon too. Like that would be like the most insane way to like teach 5-year-olds how to share, right? And so there's like this whole like movement that Open Hardware is doing of empowering people, empowering exploration and personalization and invention and innovation. And that makes me feel really good, right? If I can like go out there and like, I can talk about that all day long, but doing it just for my own product so that like I could make more money in the world, like just kind of felt sort of weird to me, but it's something you have to do if you're doing a Kickstarter or crowdsourced, you know, funding campaign. And I think even like, you know, even as a business, right? Like this was kind of at the top of the call. We talked about, you know, how do you get known for your open hardware? Where do you put it, right? You just have to talk about it all the time. You're on Twitter, you're on Reddit, you're on like all these different platforms. And so you're just constantly like, it's a lot of energy and it's a lot to do. And for me, that was just really hard. So
it is extremely hard. I can confirm this. So I would like to ask now, when you are talking about this, can your organization help, for example, with promotion, or are there some mentors or who could help people who would like to start with open source hardware?
So yeah, so we have a couple different programs currently, which and it's really exciting because we're expanding one of them. But we have the Ada Lovelace Fellowship, which is these are our current fellows here. So this is a fellowship that looks at underrepresented populations in tech, and we give stipends for professional development. And these are fellows who are interested in getting into open hardware, interested in like, you know, the concept of it, interested in getting some professional development for it, building things, whatever. And so we've done this through our summit in the past. And so it was kind of like we would pay for travel and you can come to our annual event. But what we recognized through the pandemic, of course, is that, you know, we didn't have to pay for travel, right? We were having virtual events. So we realized that it was possibly even like more important for them to get a professional development stipend so they could purchase either some really important piece of equipment that would help move their hardware forward, or so they could, you know, get some training from, you know, do a class or pay for a class or whatever it happens to be. And it can be individualized to each fellow for what they need for professional development. And then simultaneously, we also...
How someone can apply for this?
Yeah, so the application process happens along with the summit. And so that it'll be like about January, usually January, February, that we have people apply. And we typically take 10 fellows. And then there's mentors that have either completed the program from years before, or there's board members or whatnot that we also like have sort of their own sort of Q&A sessions for, where we can talk to where fellows can talk to the mentors and things like that.
So do they need to have like some projects in mind, or how do you pick up who can... So we don't require that they have done open source hardware before. They just have to be open source hardware curious, right? So this is very much an on-ramping program. This is a program that if you're interested in open source hardware but you don't know how to do it, this is like that kind of a program. And then we have another
fellowship that we just launched. So we ended up getting a sizable grant from the Sloan Foundation. And then we kind of became grantors ourselves with that funding. And so we gave $50,000 and $100,000 grants to people at universities. And so this is a very university specific fellowship. And we gave people the funding basically to become like trailblazers at their universities for open hardware. So all these people have already done open hardware, but we want to know their stories about how they did it in their university. Where was that red tape? How did they get through their red tape? How can they learn from other, how can they teach other people at universities to basically do what they've done to create open source hardware? And so we have an astrophysicist, we've got somebody who's in textiles, we've got somebody who does arts and cultural heritage. We've got a couple people actually who do, who are in the biomedical field, those two folks. Then we've got some people who are doing more like open hardware on the education platform. So educating, K through 12, whatnot. We've got somebody doing carbon capture. So lots of global warming issues around that, robotics, and another person doing education K through 12. So we're hoping that this is an annual-ish kind of grant that we can continue giving and sort of build out this whole network of people in universities doing open hardware, and then sort of becoming mentors for each other as they kind of ladder up in the program, and continue to like sort of really unlock the university. Because when you think about universities, it is such a natural fit for open source hardware, because a lot of universities have within their mission statement that they are trying to also educate beyond their borders and trying to, educate the public. They've got this entire mission. However, it is really rare that universities are doing open source hardware. And that is because they've instilled this concept of a tech transfer office in somewhere around the 80s, where universities should be making all this money on products that they can put out. So then they sort of pushed their professors and stuff to productize, and part of that has become this entire patenting thing. And now you can see some research says that universities spend more money on attempting to get the patents than they do recouping those costs, right? And so it's not even, so it's like not even like a lucrative program. And so we're saying, hey, universities, especially universities getting public funding from taxpayers, it should be your responsibility to share this innovation with the taxpayers and with people who are in your communities, and with your mission to expand beyond your borders and educate communities. And the way to do that is through open source hardware. And so we're right now doing the baby steps. Like, we've got a lot of people to talk to at universities, right? It's the tech transfer office, it's the deans, and how people are measured, because right now a lot of engineering programs are measured on how many patents they get, but instead they could be measured on how many open source hardware repos they have, how many pull requests they've gotten, how many derivatives somebody's made. All of those different things would also, show you how important your hardware is and how useful it is by other people using it.
It could promote the universities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also like free marketing, right? Especially with that attribution, if you have to give attribution back and talk about that. So so those are all of our latest minted fellows. But being a nonprofit is also difficult because we can't really promote for-profit things. So we focus a lot on promoting people rather than promoting the items behind the people. Just because of our tax status in the US, we can't promote for-profit.
So this is interesting. So if someone really maybe needs some help with open source project, maybe they can contact you, and maybe you can help them somehow, or I don't know.
Yeah, and we also have our forums, and we have our Discord channel as well, so people can, ask folks there as well and get the entire community's response rather than just our response. But we're always here to help too. A lot of people come to us asking mostly about licensing help or certification help. I feel like there's a lot of different platforms out there to get sort of the business help or the idea help or the engineering help, you know, a lot of different places for that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I would like to ask, I have the next question, like,
Yeah.
what are the other benefits of doing open source hardware? Like, when we don't think about making money, are there some other benefits why people should do it? I have
Yes.
something in mind, but I would like to
Okay.
hear
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. So other benefits, I think, just looking to see if I have a slide.
You know, because people may be asking, oh, why should I design open source hardware?
Yeah. So other benefits, I think, is like you do it kind of for the good of humanity, right? So environmental initiatives. This is a cute little open source hardware sailboat that sails around and cleans up oil spills, right? And so this company said like, hey, we don't want to just be doing this for profit. We want to do this because we want to clean up oil spills around the world. And if you're going to do that, you need to create something in a way that also has the most accessible parts in various locations, right? So you can basically build these wherever you happen to be. If it's, you know, the US or Thailand or Saudi Arabia or like wherever you happen to be, right? So being able to basically build this where your location's at and put it in the water is like incredibly, incredibly helpful for their main goal of cleaning up oil spills. One of our fellows also, do we still have them up? One of our fellows, Manu Prakash, so his whole research at Stanford currently is making like 25-cent microscopes for anywhere in the world, right? And so it's like a foldable paper microscope that he's designed. And so you know, he's trying to basically democratize medicine, right? And so for that particular reason, like he's not out there trying to make money. And he's actually arguing that in fact, medicine should be at an attainable rate where anybody can like have access to medicine, right? Another really interesting place that is doing this is the CZI Institute. So they are creating an initiative. So the CZI Institute is a Chan Zuckerberg Institute, which is the Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, right? And so you'd think, you know, depending on your thoughts of the guy, you might think he's at least a good business person. He's clearly made a ton of money. And so he would know a good business model when he saw it. But instead of creating, so he's got an initiative he's put $100 million into open sourcing vaccines. And, you know, again, it's like for the good of the world, right? It's not something that he's doing to necessarily make money off of, but his nonprofit is backing this whole open science initiative because it's for humanity. It's for humanity to survive, right? I think there is a responsibility for humanity to share a particular amount of information out there, right? We've done it since the beginning of time. And it's interesting because I think it was really easy to share at first because everybody was like in very small like villages or tribes, right? Where you could share stories, you could share how to do things quite easily. Things were passed down from generations. And even like through, when you think of like the 1950s, right? It was easy to share with, well, I should say in the 1800s, and I think got a little harder because patents were invented, right? And then I think it became, you know, in the 1950s, we had like manuals, we had instruction books, we could fix our own things. There's this promotion to fix your own stuff, right? You could fix your own cars, and everything was at a human scale. So you could easily see like, oh, I understand where the carburetor is because I can see the carburetor, right? And so now that things are going to this chip level, which is no longer human scale, you can't see where all the bits are going anymore. And so it's getting like sort of harder to share because now it's like certain experts sort of understand those layers. And so I think what open hardware is trying to do is sort of like swing the pendulum back the other way again and say like, okay, let's make this again, like more easy to share, right?
Okay, let's go back to my question. Like, okay, so what are the other benefits? So doing it for good reasons, and what other benefits people can get? For example, some people do it because maybe they can get experience, they can they can learn new skills, then they can get better job, or I don't know.
One of the things I used to teach at CU Boulder, and one of the things I would always tell my students is like, have some open source hardware projects. Because if you get an internship at some, closed research place, you won't be able to tell your future employers or show your future employers your work. You can talk about it, but with open source, you can show them your GitHub files. You can show them your website and the projects that you've done. They can look through your code. They can look through your projects and say, oh, this person knows what they're doing. I'm going to hire that person, right? It also, I think, because things are so public, it makes you really hone in. You want to put out your best work. You don't want to just put out some like sloppy kind of stuff that will just pass.
I agree with this.
Because the community will also like call you on it, right? The community will say like, hey, like this line of code, like these lines of code don't make any sense, or this particular way you routed the hardware could be much more efficient, or, like, why don't you do your build platform this way?
I would like to ask, do you know, when we are talking about electronics, do you know what, for example, people usually use to design the boards, what kind of tools or how they do it?
Yeah.
I don't think they use Altium or something. I would expect KickCAD.
Right.
Or...
No, totally. So I think in the very, in the beginning of open, when we were really gathering the community around open hardware in like 2010-ish, people were using a lot of Eagle because there was a free version of Eagle available for 2-layer boards. But KiCad was available, but a lot of people had, some, felt it was lacking features or whatnot. But over the past decade, KiCad has grown immensely, has really put a lot of tools in. And so now there is like a true option out there of open source software that you can use to build your open source hardware. So KiCad's a really great example of that. Fritzing is another platform. I should be pulling these up. Fritzing. And so this is a great platform that is extremely graphical for graphical kind of people. But it kind of looks like this. It creates these really nice looking diagrams. And so you can just drag and drop your things, and you can, put your wire over here. And then, so this is like a very like physical sort of like, this is the physical manifestation of the schematic, right, that you're creating, but then it can create a schematic for you, and it can even create the board files for you. So it's a pretty powerful little program. And the other one I mentioned was KiCad. Oops, KiCad. And so this is, open source PCB software. So
usually, maybe when people would like to design something open source, they would like to also use open source tools to design it. So basically anyone can build on the top of the project.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah, one of the things that we're kind of really pushing on Ashwa is, hey, use open source tools when they're available, right? So if it's open source hardware through and through, there's a layer that gets lost within the accessibility of your stuff if it's not an open source tool, right? If the tool costs too much, that like locks a whole layer of people out. And if there's a similar tool that's open source, then of course we say that, you should use the open source tool. It's just that for a lot of industries, the open source tool doesn't exist yet. But I think, I'm really, I think the future is more and more in open source tools.
And they're actually becoming better and better.
Yes, they're becoming better and better. Exactly. They're like matching the features that the closed source have. And I think they're becoming better and better.
Do we have some other slides which we didn't mention?
About this. So innovation has 4 paths to take, right? You can put it in the public domain, you can open source it, you could patent it, you could also trade secret it, right?
What
so
does
trade
it mean,
secret
public domain?
Yeah, so public domain is actually even more open than open source. Public domain does not require you to give back any kind of attribution, doesn't have any licensing at all on it. So you basically just post it on the internet, in the public domain, and say, hey, do absolutely whatever you want with it. It is like not even mine anymore. It belongs to the public.
Mm-hmm.
So it's funny to think that, like, you know, open source, this term open, is actually slightly more closed than putting it in the public domain. But yeah, open source, it's still yours, right? People give you attribution. And it's interesting because a patent, you actually have to go through a lot of the same things. It's just kind of like a different ending, I think, to it, right? So both open source and a patent, you have to publish your design files. And you have to publish your design files publicly. And, you know, for patents, that's through the USPTO, for open source, that's through the internet.
Can we open the website? Because I think maybe people would like to know where they can do these patents and trademarks.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So this is how they can do it in the US.
Exactly. Yes, and so every government has their own patent and trade office, right? So that's where you would go to do this kind of thing. So yeah, so you can also search for patents here, right? So you can make sure that you're not like infringing on anybody's patent before you start your work. Because prior art still is important, right? So you cannot get a patent on things that have prior art, meaning that, like, if somebody's already invented it, somebody's created it, if it's publicly findable, then you are not allowed to patent it. Let's see. Oh yeah, so you have to, right, so you have to, like, you know, post to the patent office, right, your discovery, just like you would do with open source hardware. But then, you know, the difference, of course, is that output, right? So like for a patent, you get this monopoly for a number of years, and then you can sue people for infringing on your innovation. And then with open source hardware, you choose to say, hey, I'm going to share my innovation instead. I'm going to say that all these people can share it as long as they abide by these particular rules. And that's kind of it, right? And you don't get the monopoly.
Do you know how much patents cost? Because I never tried to file.
So they are pretty expensive to file. One of the fee just for the patent, I want to say, is something like 17,000, but that doesn't take in, you know, you probably need an engineer and you need a lawyer to file the patent. And so paying their fees, you know, usually I've heard people say it's about $50,000 to file a patent.
You need to really believe to your
right. That's the other thing, is like a lot of makers within our community that started the whole open hardware movement don't have $50,000, and the people who do in our movement say, I would rather spend that $50,000 on R&D. That's going to make me more money than a patent's going to make me. So they choose, again, it's a business decision, right?
So trademark is much cheaper and much easier.
Trademark is much cheaper. Yes, trademark is much, much cheaper. And copyright is free.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and let's go back to your slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so patent and trade secret. Okay.
Yes, and so the difference with trade secret is you basically don't tell anybody about your design, and you just hope that nobody can reverse engineer it, right? Like, you don't patent it, you don't, you know, open source it, you keep it under lock and key, and you trust your employees, and you like really hope that nobody ever says anything. And so that's like, for example, how Coca-Cola works. Coca-Cola does not have a patent on their beverage. They have a trade secret.
Mm-hmm. And trademark.
Right, and trademark, yes.
Mm-hmm. And that's everything for this video. I would like to say thank you very much to Alicia for finding time and preparing all the materials for this video. Thank you, Alicia. And if you have any questions or feedback, please leave them in the comments under this video. If you like this video, don't forget press like button. If you would like to be notified about my future videos, don't forget to subscribe. It helps a lot. I would like to thank you very much for watching and see you next time. Bye.